Welcome to the Traversal for Robert DiChiara's detective adventure game, A Sucker in Spades. Today's event marks the first of 9 traversals planned for the year and hosted by the Electronic Literature Lab at Washington State University, Vancouver. I'm Deanie Grigard, the lab's director, and with me today performing is Mariusz Pozarski, who's coming to us from London via Zoom. Also with me is sound artist John Barber, who's a professor in the Creative Media and Digital Culture program here at the university. Greg Philbrook, the tech guru for the lab and the program. Holly Slocum, the project manager for the lab, and Kathleen Zoller, our undergraduate researcher. Let me say a few quick words about A Sucker in Spades so you'll understand why this event is a very exciting one for us to host. Well, first, it's a detective adventure game / novel that was released on a 3.5-inch floppy disk for the Macintosh computer back in 1988. It's also the second of 47 works published by Eastgate Systems between 1988 and 2004. And it's one of the only, there's 3 of these, but one of 3 that was published on the company's own hypertext authoring system called Hypergate. In other words, it's a very rare and in tech time old work. In fact, this copy that I have is one of the only ones I ever have come across in my research. What's also interesting about this work is it comes from the author's own choose your own adventure story called A Sucker in Spades that was published in a collection of 3 works in a book called Hardboiled back in 1985. So the game came out 3 years later. And what's also finally interesting is that the game language follows the novel's language almost exactly. It's very close. Sucker in Spades also uses the language, themes, and situations found in detective novels, right? So women are dames, men are saps and suckers who fall for them. Detectives are gumshoes who have loyal secretaries and come into conflict often with police called coppers. The title is interesting because it draws on the detective from Dashiell Hammett's 1930 novel, The Maltese Falcon. That detective's name was Sam Spade. What's also interesting is it plays on the idea of in spades, which means in an extreme. So the player who's playing this game bumbles around trying to solve this murder mystery, at the same time getting beaten up by thugs and seduced by many femme fatales. He's essentially a sucker in spades, right? So without any further ado, here is Mariusz Pozarski performing Robert DiChiara's A Sucker in Spades. Thank you so much. Game bumbles around trying to solve this murder mystery. A Sucker in Spades. Thank you so much.
Hello. Am I heard well?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Hello everyone. I'm really glad to be here. The sense of community on the chat is amazing. I'm here on Zoom from London, UK, and I will be reading from a live stream on YouTube, which will be controlled by Professor Dini Grigar and manipulated by her in the lab, whereas I'm reading on the I'm reading from Zoom and from YouTube. I will be performing for around 40 minutes. By this time, during this time, we will not be seeing and talking to each other with Dini. After that, we will be joined for a Q&A. Let me just now start the timer. And I think I'm ready to go, and let's dive into this amazing detective story and see how it plays through. Dini, I'm ready. I'm waiting for the disk to be loaded. It's a 3.5-inch diskette. that some of us know, some of us don't. Okay, the Eastgate Systems disk is loaded and we are ready now to boot it up. Let's start the disk. I will also mention that there is a 2-second delay between London and then the lab, so please be patient and be aware of that. And there's two files, a Saccharine Spades and a Hypergate file. Hypergate is a software that was developed by Mark Bernstein and is the platform for the novel in this case. The Saccharine Spades has 369 kilobytes, which is quite a lot. I think Afternoon was around the same size. Let's click the file to load it up. And here we go. Yes, we see the opening screen. Saccharine Spades by Robert DiChiara, and then we have the all the necessary information about the publisher and cooperators. Let's go to see some instructions because they should be crucial for this playthrough. Let's click instructions first, and then after that we will start. (1988). This work comes from, is an adaptation actually of a book that was published in 1985. We'll speak about it a bit more. You play Saccharine Spades like you read a book. Instead of turning pages, you pick up choices by clicking the mouse inside your choices. Here are the directions. Saccharine Spades is a new kind of fiction, like a paper novel. It presents a subtle and complex mystery. Like an adventure game, it often puts you in charge, determining what actions you would take to solve the mystery. Using your wits, your detective skills, and your character's reserves of moxie, muscle, and magnetism, you must solve a most puzzling case. Be sure to look at your case notes frequently. You can see your desktop and notes at any time by clicking on the Case Notes thumb tab. We can see that on the left on the bottom tab. Make notes on the Office Detective Agency forms whenever a new clue pops up, another suspect surfaces, or you just get a good idea. Don't abbreviate. You need to be absolutely certain of what you're looking for and who and what you found. Okay, I think that is enough for the directions, and we'll be ready to start now. Case notes are important. We'll be looking at them and we'll be making some notes. So this is not only a hypertext or a digital game book, but at the same time also a bit of a cybertext as well, because if a reader can input some text, it's already a textonic function. Return to cover. And let's click start. And of course, as in many RPGs and game books, we can choose some character preferences. We leave it at the default. Our name is Colleen, we are female, and maybe instead of knitting, let's go for boxing as a hobby. As you can see, all these fields are editable, and we can change whatever we want. For the moment, we don't change the name and nickname. We just change the hobby from knitting to boxing. This will be a more of a contemporary female detective At least we try. And we go OK. Why we have 21 gallons of fish as the number of our pets, I have no idea, but this already shows you that this fiction is a sort of a tongue-in-cheek fiction. Let's click OK and we'll be ready to start. Okay, we are presented with a drawing, digital drawing of a detective in an agency. Let's click maybe on the drawing if it makes us see something else, if a text window pops up, or it's just completely uninteractive. It's not. Okay, let's then continue. Let's click continue. It's like a hand-drawn illustration. That was then loaded to Hypergate. It's a busy day at the office. Dust balls gather around your shoes and you're watching the flies do barrel rolls over your desk. Then a blonde walks in. Continue. As we can see, it's quite a linear progression at the moment. We only have case notes option and cover. We don't do case notes yet. And we are at the office. A blonde walks in, a skinny thing named Amanda Quincy. She's dressed like a minister's daughter, proper skirt and long-sleeve top with a neckline up to her eyebrows. "This is no time for long sleeves, honey," you tell her. But she looks drawn and distracted and joins the flies in ignoring you. She just sits down and tells you her story. There's always a story. Let's continue. It's great that the work just takes all the screen available for us. And the screens were small. She's a Midwest girl, Illinois, and she's engaged to a salesman named Lance Farrell who came out here on business and sent her for her later so they could get married. But when she arrived, Lance wasn't at the hotel. He wasn't anywhere. The cops were no help to her, which is no news to you. Then suddenly she got a note from Lance telling her to meet him at the Hotel Palm today at 4 o'clock, room 18. She says she's afraid to go there. She feels something is wrong. So do you, but with nothing better to do, you take the case. Let's continue. You say you'll meet her lover boy yourself and ring her later. She runs down Lance's looks. Tall, crew cat, 25, a smooth talker who could sell you swampland with both your feet sunk to the ankles in muck. You think maybe he's a real estate scam. You try to think of someone in this town who isn't. You shrug and head for the Hotel Palm. Let's continue. This is actually a segmented introduction from the book, which runs for about 2 pages in the paper game book version. But soon we will be out in town and be ready to roam the locations. Hotel Palm. When you enter the Hotel Palm, you get hit with the smell of folded money. It's the kind of joint what puts chandeliers in the joints. You figure maybe Lance did make his California score, but he must be keeping on the QT because you find roommate registered under another handle, Simon Temperance. At his door, no one answers. Your knocks, so you grab the knob. It works, and the door springs open. Inside, there's a quieter layout. Fuzzy white rugs, windows that face the ocean, furniture made from wood older than your thighs, which makes it pretty damn old. Let's continue. It would be a swell place to stay if there wasn't a dead man lying all over the canopy bed. He's a fat-faced, bearded Johnny in pajamas, and by description, definitely not Lance. He looks like he was strangled with the finesse of a professional. No sign of a struggle gives that hunch even more weight. You frisk his pants, which drape over a velvet chair. Let's continue. This font is actually, the font that is used here is very good for those environment of small screens and even today's streaming technologies. You can see them clearly. In one pocket you find a matchbook from the Copper Club. In another, a post office box key. You spot a crumpled note with the name Sal Catarzi scribbled in red ink and with a shaky hand, as if Temperance was telling you who put the chill on him. But the whole thing smells like sardines in July. No pro would leave a body with a breath left in it, never mind a writer's itch. The phone book tells you Catarzi lives at 222 La Brea. You pocket the note and call for the law. Then you call Amanda and tell her about Temperance. You called the police, right? She screams. You called the police. Let's continue. Sure, you say. Relax, Dreamboat. We'll find Lance on our own time. She says she'll be at the Regent Hotel if you need her. Then the cops walk in and carrying snooze and shooting off questions. Your pal, Lieutenant Riker, wants to know everything. So you tell him everything. Well, everything except about Amanda and the Catarzi note. Let him work for the taxpayers, though. Continue. Okay, here we are at the end of the introduction, and we see a panel screen. Choose how you want to divide your strength between muscle, magnetism, and moxie. You have a total of 125 points. By default, we were assigned 45 muscle, 40 magnetism, and 40 moxie. Because we like we are good in boxing, I think we'll just add 20 more in muscle and take off that 20 from magnetism. And moxie, I would say it's good in any circumstances. Then we'll leave moxie as is. So 65 moxie muscle, 20 magnetism. It probably would work with detective, but with a detective, female detective maybe. And Moxie stays at 40, yes. And let's see what will be the effect of that. 425, that's it, yes. Okay, and we can see on the bottom stripe that there are our stats: muscle 65, magnetism 20, moxie 40, and these will be changing as we go. And we can see a cityscape, probably something like a police station, maybe even. Another hand drawing. Down these mean streets a few good men must go. Keep telling yourself that. Maybe it will stop you from thinking of how you should have gone to trade school like your old lady wanted. Let's hit the road then. Something bad is about to happen. Which of the following would you prefer to lose? Okay, it's already an operation on our stats. Let's lose Moxie. We will be also able to acquire new points, so it's not a big loss to lose something one time. Let's choose Moxie. Your car says, "Sayonara, Charlie," smack in the middle of noon traffic. You had a hunch this would happen when the piston head started playing taps under the hood 3 miles back. This is one of the notes, that one of the segments that it sounds like a random one that we are presented whenever we go out on the street from one location to another. We'll encounter some more of these, and it's very interesting because it can be random, but I'm not yet sure. Let's choose next place. And here we are presented with a schematic of locations. 4 of them are open. They look like open because they're in black. Let's go to Sal Katarz's apartment. And we can expect some of these other ones to be opened as we solve the case, as we progress. Oh, the secretary goofed. A dame shouldn't have been assigned to this case. It's too politically incorrect and potentially explosive. Reassign this case to a male colleague, please. Yes, and this is as far as we can go with a female detective. Unfortunately, as we can see, the hard-boiled genre and the film noir don't allow for a main detective to be female, and we as readers, we don't have any choice about that. Then we'll just have to say okay. Everything will stay the same. The sex was already changed to male, so let's click OK. I would, of course, maybe change the name and nickname, but I think time is precious, so let's say I'm called Sam Spades, but let's just click OK and go. Sam Spades is that character from Maltese Falcon, played by Humphrey Bogart. Looking for Sal Catarzi. You knock on his door and his neighbor, an old nosy dame, opens hers. Maybe if you knocked on her door, Catarzi would open his. She gives you the once-over and snaps her head in approval. About time, she says. About time that immortal beast got his. Let's continue. Another drawing of the neighbor of Catarzi. Got his what? You ask playfully. She straightens up and jerks her housecoat. What's coming to him? She snarls. And I hope it's a fistful of knuckles and a set of busted choppers, and a good poke in the belly on the side. Want to hold the mashed-in nose, you say, or was that busted ribs to go? Let's continue. As we can see, this language, this style is just unbelievable. It has its character. As a non-English speaker, I was just browsing for idioms here and also training my computer to help me speak or pronounce this. She climbs up and jerks her coat again. I'm no bruiser, takeout service lady, you say. I'm just looking for Sal Catarzi. You seen him? Maybe, she says coyly. And the system asks us to use Moxie or magnetism. Let's use Moxie. We don't have much magnetism. Let's use Moxie. You're a bill collector then, she says, or better yet, the taxman. You squeeze your eyes shut, then pop one open. You say you're the taxman. Goody, she says. Let's continue. Our Moxie is now at 25. Quite a pricey move it was. She says Catarzi is a real no-gooder, a piece of scam acting like Cat Diamonds, who's kind of assistant manager of a nightclub downtown. A place where they drink a lot, she's sure. You not. Worst of all, he drags this red-headed dish up to his apartment all the time, and on the sly too. God knows what they do, she says. You not. He's not home, she says, but you find him and get him good. You not. Bow, and then get the hell out of here. Okay. I think that's the good time for us to look at case notes. Maybe we'll just note down that redhead partner of Catarzi, just to make a note. This will be one of our clues. So Sal Catarzi's name is found in the dead body of we found in a hotel, and now we know that a redhead lady is frequenting his apartment. If we can click on case notes and see how they look. This is that element of the work where we are strategizing. And 3 windows pop up. One has a question, where is Lance Farrell? We don't know that. Let's go for another one. And these are our objectives. And then the system will give us some score at the end of the game. The other question is, who killed Simon Temperance and why was Temperance killed? Okay. Let's just maybe make a note here. A redhead female at Catharsis apartment. Yeah, I think at the moment anywhere here will do, just as a note for us to remember that. And there's that button clean off desk, which will probably allow us to grade. So we've made a note. This is a classical tectonic activity of Espen Arset's theory of cybertext. Let's clean up the desk and go back to our mission. Checking out the town. The cute waitress you've been seeing spots you on the street and she's real sore you haven't called. You say you're on a case, but she gets on yours. You sweet talk her with promises of paradise and 2 tickets to the fights. Let's choose the next place. This is another of these transition segments between locations. And we have Post Office Copper Club and Regent Hotel available to us. Let's go to the Post Office because we have found a Post Office key, Postbox key. Let's see what clues might lay there. At the post office, you open the PO box with your key and find a logbook keeping money records. Money going to a Ted Mooney from Leonard Wilson. Big money. The name Mooney rings a bell. Something about a newspaper story and dope. You figure to do some research sometime at the library. Okay. So we have an information about drug dealing operation, and another name comes up. Let's click decide what to do next. And let's also imagine that we made these notes in the case notes, but we won't be doing them now literally because the time is precious. Decide what to do next. Something bad is about to happen. Which of the following would you prefer to lose? Okay, we have 65 muscle, magnetism 17, moxie 25. Let's lose magnetism. Maybe just to try and see what happens if we completely deplete it. It's interesting if these prompts are also random, or not. Your car says adios muchachos, smack in the middle of morning traffic. You had a hunch this would happen when it started getting the rumba 3 miles back. Let's choose the next place. Rumba was popular these days, 1930s, 40s, I believe. Okay, let's go for public library to find out more about these drug operations and arrests. We've only lost 3 points of magnetism. That wasn't that bad. We have a lot of muscle to spend. Public library. The reference librarian is a brainy number with cheaters on and shapely measurements that have nothing to do with the Dewey Decimal System. We have an option. You go to her for assistance, or you figure to stay clear of dames for a while, especially ones with smarts, and you hit the newspaper stacks yourselves. Let's go for her assistance. I need help, you tell her. Her eyes dart from her book to your swamp trench and back to her book. You certainly do, she says. The Salvation Army is 2 blocks down on the left. You flash your card under her lenses. Oh, she flusters. Really? Her face reddens. She then relaxes, and she licks her lips and smiles. Are you really a private eye? She says. Her horn rims start to steam up. You figure that's a good sign. Let's continue. Only 3 points of magnetism left. You spend lots of time getting your thumbs dirty on old daily newspapers. Finally, the article you're rooting for turns up. It says Ted Mooney got himself stuck in the slammer on big-time dope dealing charges for 8 years. The dope ring supposedly cleared out of Chicago and set up a shop in LA, with Mr. Big never even fingered. A photo next to the piece shows the obvious fall guy for the ring, Ted Mooney, alias Simon Temperance. He looked better in pajamas. Let's choose the next place. So that guy we found in a hotel at the beginning was quite a figure. You run into, and we back on the streets checking out the town. You run into ex-detective Sergeant Murphy, a crooked cop from way back, who's pounding a beat now instead of serving time like he ought. You crack wise about his feet getting flatter, so he saps you for the exercise. Right. Let's go and choose the next place and see what happens to our stats. A Copper Club and Regent Hotel left. Let's choose the Copper Club. I first heard that name when I worked in a bar in London by MI5 headquarters, and the Coppers were frequent guests. Copper. The Copper Club. The Copper Club is a dive with a new coat of paint which makes it clean enough for the Board of Health and slimy enough to be real popular. The place is buzzing like hungry bees. You get introduced to some honey, Mrs. Carla Wilson, the owner's wife. She's got the sleek line of an old convertible hair like a hot red sunrise. She sips champagne and offers you a glass, and maybe more. Let's continue. And I would do the case notes here, but let's just remember what's happening. Future games will remember this for us, and just pinpoint the important characters we meet and clues. Her husband, Leonard Wilson, appears from his office, followed by 5 broad-shouldered mugs all dressed in floppy black hats and pine-strip suits. They look like the Dion Queens gone crooked. Wilson himself is a thin, hard man in his 50s whose face has more angles than features. You figure he wears a dark gray suit to make sure it's color coordinated with his complexion. He shakes your hand like he's using pliers, then shoots a stare to his wife that will give a polar bear frostbite. Let's continue. So we meet the boss, I believe. If you have 5 mugs around you, you are a boss. He leaves the club. It was a hard welcome to sit through, even harder on account of Carla's hand playing squeeze box with your kneecap. She says her lips feel hot. You figure you could either dunk her head in the champagne bucket or kiss her silly. You think about it. And here is again the choice, muscle or magnetism. Let's try magnetism and see how far we go with it. 3 points left. You kiss her hard. Your lips are having a swell time, but a watchful eye spots a bouncer in a distant corner and he's raising an eyebrow. As long as it's not a blackjack, you think. She smiles, then hardens. My marriage to Mr. Wilson is strictly business. That's what he thinks too. I don't care what he thinks, she says. She bites the nape of your neck. Let's continue. I have some business to do, you say to her. She looks puzzled. Ever heard of Simon Temperance? You say. Her curvy hot coal figure stiffens, then cools like the hard edge of an icebox. Let's continue. She goes pale and lets out a muted gasp. She says she's been threatened a few times lately in letters from someone who signs them by that name. Not really signs them, she says. All the words in the notes are cut out from newspapers, so I can't tell who did it. And you never knew a Simon Temperance, you ask. No, never, she says. Let's continue. Our magnetism after this encounter is at -10, but I think we've done great, even without it, or with just 3 points. What do they threaten, you ask? She pulls at her napkin and bites her lip. They threaten to tell Leonard about my lover unless I pay a price. I wouldn't think you'd care either way, you say. I would normally, but she stops then says, those letters are driving me crazy. You say she'll be getting less mail from now on. She grabs your hand and says she wants you to come to her own private apartment sometime for a few drinks. Sure, you say. And I think it's past 42, 43 minutes now, and let's just click continue to see what options we have, but we probably will be wrapping up this playthrough. But I'm sure that we have an idea of how it develops. We're getting deeper and deeper into the mystery, and more clues are coming up. She has an appointment and leaves the club, and there are two choices. We decide to shoot the breeze with the bartender, or we sneak behind the bandstand to locate Leonard Wilson's office. It should be nice and vacated. Let's decide to bartender. And if Dini, if you think this is what we, if the time is up, then I'm happy to finish here. But if not, we'll proceed.
It might be good to start talking about the story with. And I want to make sure you can hear me with my mask on because I'm supposed to be keeping it on while I'm on campus. So can you hear me okay, Mariusz, with my mask on?
I can hear you okay, but I will be leaning a bit over my screen to hear you a bit better.
I'll talk a little louder. Is that better?
That's better,
and
yes.
I'm going to pick up my laptop because students are going to be asking, and there might be folks in the audience, students and others, who may want to ask questions. So let me say a few things to the audience so that you'll know what we're doing. We're moving into the question and answer session. Mariusz is going to be on screen talking and answering questions. I'm moderating through the YouTube chat. So anyone who has a question can post them in the chat, and then I will ask those questions directly to Mariusz. He will answer them on camera so that we can capture his answers. He's also going to be showing us the book with the map of LA and other items that coincide with this story that's the digital story. So we'll be doing a little bit of that. But we do have a question first from Richard Schneider, and Richard is a PhD student at Washington State University, Vancouver in the English department. He loves electronic literature, and he's been very involved. He teaches in our program and very involved with electronic literature, and he was at the ELO conference this past summer presenting on eLit. So Richard asks, in the directions page, you deliberately speak about the work as a hybrid between paper novel and game. Was this form encouraged by the affordances of the Hypergate environment specifically?
I think in 1985, when this book appeared, this story appeared as a book, the game book genre was in its golden age, but at the same time, maybe some of its authors were thinking that this is already a bit of a tired formula of the readers having the dice and paper and pen and noting everything down, jumping from paragraph to paragraph slowly, deducting the stats manually. And when the computers appeared, it probably presented a good chance for them to speed that formula up. And I think Hypergate allowed for that. We have already a automated stat distribution. We don't have some of the elements of the paper book. Of course, we're losing some as well, but I think because some of these gamebook elements are automated and some of them are just remediated, like the case notes that DiChiara decided to leave and decided for us to act on those notes like we were using pen and paper. This makes it a bit of a work on the crossroads between the analog and the digital. And of course, we also lose something on the way to that digital migration. For example, this map of the LA locations. Not sure if you are able to see that. Is obviously in 1988 digital environment presented only very, very moderately with no graphic details. So let's say this is something that we lose, but at the same time, we gain a bit of a speed and a sense of accelerated exploration of the game book.
The other thing I want to mention, Marios and I both did a lot of research trying to get information about how this was developed. I tracked down the artist who created the fonts, who's mentioned in the opening screen. I tracked down also the fact that the author was influenced to make this work from his book by a professor in New York State. And I tracked down that person and left him several notes. He's not responded to me yet, but I'd like to, once I get that information, Marius and I can use that in an article that we're going to write about this work. And then I tracked down the author. I couldn't find him anywhere. I did find that his father died some years ago, but I couldn't find any information about him. So there's some interesting things when we work with these old works to be able to find people who are associated with the development of them. And as we continue gathering detective work, this detective work, which is what research is all about, right? Historical research is detective work. Digging that out, from the past and talking about it in the present is something that this class that I'm teaching in game history should be very excited about.
Exactly, like our research is an allegory of this character's mission in his fictitious locations and this fiction, because we also look for solving up this mystery of digital soccer and spades.
Two more really good questions, Kathleen and Dave. So Kathleen asks, Marius, have you ever encountered a sucker in spades before? If not, can you relate to us your first experience with the hypertext work or electronic literature in general?
Thank you very much, Kathleen, because this question is just touching the soft point in me, because my adventure with hypertext started exactly in the year when that work was published, but back in Poland, behind the Iron Curtain, in 1985, a paragraph game book, first paragraph game book in Poland was published in a young adults newspaper. It was a fantasy game book, an original Polish story, and just by accident I bought it, and from now on I was just hooked to paragraph stories and branching narratives. which then, of course, years later came back to me in the 90s in form of this aha moment or deja vu when I've encountered hypertexts. And my first one was Judy Malloy's Loved One. And this was an experience. Then I read DiChiara's by Stuart Moulthrop, and this led me to Eastgate's Classic, and that was 1998, 1999. But it all started, that fascination, with paragraph game books.
So we have another question too. So I'm going to do Dave's, and then we'll move into Dimitri's. So Dave's question is, I wonder what it would take to transfer a game like this into a Twine format or other platform. That's a fun one to answer, right, Mariusz? We're talking a lot about how to transfer media from one to
Yes.
another, and hypertext especially.
From what I know and what I taught and what I created in Twine, it looks like you can quite easily recreate the system present in Soccer and Spades on the Twine platform. There's a whole library of macros and functions that are user-friendly. You don't need to know JavaScript much. You just know some basic grammar of that scripting, and then you are able to recreate that kind of hopscotching between paragraphs and the statistic systems, and of course also the guard fields, which are also present here on this Hypergate platform, because as you might have guessed, you have those locations that you cannot access initially, but then they become open for you to explore on some conditions. If you, for example, visited a Catharsis apartment, then you are able to go to another place. These guard fields you are also able to recreate in Twine with the history macro, which records a history of readers' steps. So yeah, that would be a great project. You can actually try to do this sort of migration.
We have a question from Dimitri. What, if any, changes do you think modern ideologies and technology would change literary work such as this today? In other words, how would it change to take this work in 1988 and transform it into a work today? What would it take to do that? Ideologically and also technically.
Well, it's a very good question. We might ask today, what, or you might ask yourself, how did you feel me reading this novel with me? If this form of detective story is something that is close to your sensitivity or your way of reading detective stories, I think. If you would want it to be made today, you probably would want to show more than make it more in a telling or narrative way. So that would be a bit more of a movie convention in a more animated genre than just the textual stuff. I think you are able to do something like that in Twine using sound, using some form of animation even, and probably you would want to show more than just to rely on text.
There's another good question too. Team DTSO. Is this work a completely accurate portrayal of the story it's based on, or are there parts that needed to be left out? And you have the whole book. I have just the scanned pieces. My book hasn't arrived yet. But so you can answer this better than I can. Or I noticed in the scan that so much was alike, but I don't have the entire 50 pages.
The whole story consists of 120 paragraphs, and basically everything is transported, everything is migrated in terms of the main text, but hopefully you'll be able to see here there is that paratext element around the paragraphs. So there is a paragraph text, but there's also this voice of a so-called game master, or this main narrator, who tells us, subtract 2 dice rolls from muscle, go to paragraph 21. That paratext element is gone because this is being processed in a computer, by the computer. So that analog game master, so to say, is actually turned into computing functions of hypergate. But the text same, one to one.
I just heard from somebody that they couldn't hear my question, so I'm kind of peeking around my mask because I am on campus and I have to keep my mask on so that we won't get kicked off campus. So I'm going to try to talk a little more loudly and peek around my mask a bit. Dimitri says, wonderful, I was thinking something similar, and surprisingly these stories feel more rich in context and dialogue than of the animated or visually focused stories I'm unsure could be recreated. I think there's a lot to be said about the lack of words in current game environments. It doesn't mean that there's not story, but the story's not always relayed textually. Do you want to respond to that, Mariusz?
Dimitri, you are completely right. What I meant by this, but emphasizing the visual element is maybe introducing some pre-action elements, some more mystery in a visual type. For example, we could show a killing that happened before the detective came to the scene in some kind of nice cinematic way, but the text itself of this work is just every sentence is a gem, and basically we would be really contributing to the gaming culture, preserving that text. But yeah, apart from that, there's also some more possibility of presenting that text in a more contemporary way, where basically every single scene from the story is shown, whereas here it's mostly in language. But the language is just so good here that you wouldn't want to really get rid of that, of course.
He's a writer who created, in fact, during this time period, and I think this was mentioned in the chat earlier by Kathleen or maybe even Holly, during this period of 1985 to 1988, we had quite a few very famous writers. Douglas Adams, who wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Thomas Disch, who did Amnesia, were hired by EA and other companies to come in and write games. And they're writing these kind of games. So you see a lot of what I call writerly game environments in the mid to late 80s. But that whole genre starts to kind of disappear, you know, when the web takes over in the mid 90s, when the browser becomes very popular. But when it was a standalone computing environment, we see a lot of this kind of exciting writing, which I thought was important difference between what's happening now. We have a question from Jazz Jackson. Have you ever played Dungeons and Dragons? If so, have you ever seen or wanted to see a hypertext fiction version of it?
Dungeons and Dragons, no, I haven't, to be honest. You mean the tabletop gaming with the game master? I haven't. I mean, I tried. There were a few sessions with a group of perhaps 8-10 people, but we never really, with our friends, got into that. So no, I'm an avid World of Warcraft player, retired but always coming back. But Dungeons and Dragons, no.
Well, something I think we were talking about earlier, Mariusz and I, is that this environment that we're using for the CMDC program, the Slack environment, has a lot of commands that came out of Dungeons and Dragons from the late 80s. And just to mention something to you all, you don't know this, or maybe you do, but Dungeons and Dragons was played, as you know, in real life, right? But when in those early years, when those young when some young boys from England went off to college, they were separated from each other and they wanted to continue to play Dungeons and Dragons. So they all managed to get their hands on a mainframe computer, and they built an environment where they could play Dungeons and Dragons online in a mainframe environment, and that environment was called a MUD, which then became a MOOS, a multi-user domain object-oriented. So MOOS and MUDs became the place where Dungeons and Dragons gravitated to in the digital age, or the early electronic age, and a lot of the commands we're using, in fact, things like laughing out loud, LOL, rolling on the floor laughing, those kinds of commands and comments came out of Dungeons and Dragons, and we're seeing them also come to play in Slack with the @ command, because that's how you talked to someone in a moo or a mud. You @ somebody. Now we're calling it direct messaging. So we could talk about this in our class a little bit, but there's a historical link between one environment to another. And as I mentioned last week, the mantra in our class is ex nihilo nihilo, feet. Nothing comes from nothing. Something's always attributed to something else. There's another question from Team DTSO. Would you consider the player experience of this work as enjoyable or more so than if a player read the story?
Oh, to be honest, that's a very good question. My first impression when I compared the book with the Hypergate version was that I really preferred this multidimensionality of the book. But then when I started to get accustomed to the digital version, I actually started to appreciate that steps that the author made to make it work on the digital platform. So they are a bit of two different domains, and each one of them has its own joys. If I have to choose now, after some time with both of these, I would probably still take the book, but for my research interests, the Hypergate version is very fascinating, and you can say a lot about it, and it represents a moment of culture, of digital culture, that is important to me and should be important to any of us.
Just to mention something else about the Hypergate environment, it's so fascinating because there's only 3 works that Mark Bernstein published with this platform. The first one is his work, The Election of 1912, which we're going to be doing this kind of playthrough for in October. So if you're interested in this platform, you'll want to come back and see that one. The other work he did was Sarah Smith's King of Space, which we've already done a performance of a couple of years ago. That work was as gameful as this environment, but it had animation and sound. Hypergate looks a lot like HyperCard, and it's built on a lot of the same programming languages. It comes out of Forth, which was a programming language that Apple used and still uses today for the computer. And so it looks a lot like HyperCard. What Mark did, though, is when he went to the 1987 Hypertext conference, the first one, he saw StorySpace in demo, and he met Michael Joyce and J. David Bolter, and was taken by this new platform because it was much more conducive for novels, for more hypertextual novels. And he ended up licensing that in 1990. And once he did that, he never went back to Hypergate. Sarah Smith's work was already in works. So even though it came out in 91, it had already begun in 1987. So he published that, and then he just turned his attention to StorySpace after that. So the lab has access to all 3 of these works. So if you're interested, anyone, let me know, because we'll make them available to you to study. I see a few more little comments and questions here. Let me make sure I don't miss anybody. Dave's talking to Jazz. He says, I currently play Idle, Champions of Dungeons and Dragons, which is, and while it isn't a tabletop, it does pop up Twitch links all the time. So the connection between Twitch and Dungeons and Dragons is interesting. And then Greg makes a comment that there are tons and tons of games that use Dungeons and Dragons rules, but the hypertext in particular is a little more rare. So any other questions or comments? We are going to be completing our Q&A in a minute, and then I'd like my students to stay on because I want to give you some directions for what we're going to do next, because our class ends at 2. But the rest of you that are here, I noticed that Richard Snyder's here, Matthew's here, Matthew Hanna. There's a lot of folks from the ELO community, ELIT community that have joined us today, and I want to thank you for coming. And know that we have a traversal every month, and this is in partnership with our 2L affiliates, Mariusz, who's one of them, and Astrid Ensign, who's going to be joining us as well. So it's exciting what's happening. We're expanding this playthrough experience so that we can continue to document these early works of electronic literature that without this documentation will not last for future generations to be able to study. So the work we're undertaking in the lab by documenting all 48 titles of Eastgate Systems, Inc. is part of this strategy to preserve this work, especially these interactive games that are so rare. So, yes, and thank you, all of you who've come. And one more question, and one more time, but before I close up today, if there's anything else you want to say or have me, a lot of thank yous to Mariusz. And
Thank
Mariusz,
you, guys.
do you want to say something before we stop?
Pardon?
Did you want to say a few parting words before we stop?
Thank you all for joining us. It's an amazing feel of community, of readers and listeners, and the techno setup here is just unbelievable. It was only a few seconds between me here in London and you in the lab and on the university and in your homes. So that's something amazing, and hopefully we will be enjoying just as much or even more our next meetings. It's amazing.
Thank you, everybody. Stay on for a second because I do want to give you some directions. And those of you who are not in my class, thank you for coming, and I'll see you maybe in October for the election of 1912, the first work ever published by Eastgate Systems, Inc., once again, on Hypergate in '88. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Mariusz. We'll talk by Slack, and you two will do a debriefing later. But thank you so much for your time and for being here from London today.
Thank you, Dini.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, team.
So students, move lab into L for a bit of kind of debriefing from this event and to talk a little bit about game mechanics. So if you want to go grab some food real fast and meet me in 15 minutes on Slack, then we'll reboot into Zoom from there. Okay, everybody? Thanks. Did they get that, Greg?